because you reduce everything to mental concepts. So when you are totally, continuously immersed in the thinking, stream of thinking, you begin to inhabit a conceptual reality which separates you from the actual aliveness that's all around you. And that's so the source of separation, sense of separation, is involuntary, continuous labeling of everything, and including yourself. You do it to yourself. You label yourself in certain ways. People have opinions about who they are, and they vary. Some people are predominantly negative, which is very unpleasant to live with a very self-critical mind that always says, well, why did you do that? You should have done better, and so on. Maybe it's your mother talking still, but it's thought. So you have that. It's a dreadful thing to have that in your head. So then you can become free of that by realizing these are the thoughts, and here's the actual situation. I've lost the train of thought, by the way.
You can.
We're talking about separation. So this is separation.
So he
arises.
separated his I am
That's
from
right.
his thoughts. So that's how you do it.
Separation then arises through that, and you can, when you go into nature, really, we can talk about it in terms of knowing. You can know. I like walking in nature, in the forest, and I can do that in two ways. I can walk through the forest and look at the trees and birds and the ferns and all the wonderful things, and comment on it and say, it's called that, or look at this wonderful bird, I wonder what it's called, and so on, and all kinds of commentary. That's one way of knowing the forest, but I can also walk through the forest and simply be absolutely present and observe without labeling it. In that sense, from a conceptual point of view, I don't know anything anymore, but there is a deeper knowing there where I can suddenly sense something that the conceptual mind can never feel, and that is the forest is alive. There is an energy field there. There is even a sacredness there, and everything is intensely alive. And I become still, and there is a sense of merging with that which you are observing with your sense perceptions. And so the sense of separation goes away, and there is a sense of oneness with that which you are perceiving. There's no longer the me and the other, because that's through conceptualization. And that's beautiful when you can walk in a forest like that. The experience of being in the forest is greatly enhanced. And if you can relate with to another human being like that, then there is a true relating. And here we come to compassion. I would say that true compassion with another human being, which is closely related to the ability to empathize, to feel the beingness of the other, to sense your way into the other, is also closely related to what we could call goodwill towards another being, benevolence. Confucius already pointed to benevolence as one of the most important things. He said, you're not even fully human if the faculty of benevolence, which is goodwill, they're really all the facets of the same faculty, has not arisen in you. Confucius said, you're not even fully human yet. So that compassion, the benevolence, the goodwill, the ability to empathize, to ultimately recognize the other as not absolutely other, all arises when the habitual and unconscious and compulsive labeling of others no longer operates. And that's where compassion can arise.
Before we came out, we were actually talking about barriers to being compassionate or connecting to others. And we were actually talking about how wonderful it is to have an animal, like a dog, because they never judge you, right? And that's really what we all want.
Yes.
Because I think that's one of our fears, is that when we intersect with another, we're going to be judged. And you have this animal that hesitantly embraces you. And in fact, we were also talking about enlightened people or people who it's wonderful to be around. Not that they're dogs, but they're, but what they do is, when you're with these people, you have this incredible sense they did just accept you for who you are with no judgment, no demands. You're just there at that moment. And I think that's...
Yes, the dog, of course, is a wonderful example.
We also talked about the GPS. The GPS doesn't judge you either, does it? Never raises its voice.
This is right. The GPS never tells you, why do you not listen to me? Why? How many times have I told you to turn this way?
So we're talking about writing a book, Dogs and GPS.
And the dog, of course, I don't know if you've heard the prayer, please God, make me into the person my dog thinks I am. Now the dog, of course, the secret is the dog doesn't think, it just experiences you. It has no labels towards you. It doesn't have the conceptual reality. It has the direct reality. So there's this enormous joy of life in the dog as expressed in the tail, the wagging tail, which is, and this is why many human beings love relating to animals, because they feel this unconditional acceptance. And you look into the eyes of a dog, and you can sense the dog's beingness unobstructed by mental stuff, that pure beingness. And by looking into the eyes of the dog and feeling the dog's beingness, actually you can sense your own beingness, and you feel, oh, it feels so good to look into the dog's eyes. And so the dog, I would say, this is what I call it, the dog is pre-thought, so it hasn't lost him or herself. I don't like to call the dog it. Like the dog hasn't lost him or herself in the mental realm yet. And when we go beyond that, like you mentioned, like people who don't have this egoic self anymore, they have a lot in common with the dog, but they have risen above thinking, and the dog is still below thinking. But both are more deeply connected with that beingness than we are. We humans, in our present, the way I see it, in our present evolutionary stage, are halfway between. The way I see it, in evolutionary terms, we are halfway between the animal and something greater than the human.
Being, a conscious, aware being that is the sum of a lot of individual people all creating this conscious bubble, that is conscious in itself. The bubble is conscious. So you can see, it just keeps building up, more and more complexity, more and, lower and lower entropy, bigger and bigger decision spaces, more places it can work, more things it can do. And then there will be multiples of these things. There'll be lots of these things, these bubbles, these conscious things that can do all this stuff. And how can they organize themselves to create lower entropy, in the whole system? They can wander around the whole consciousness system. They're not even here. So you see, it just keeps leveling up. That's the point. The larger conscious system is still evolving. And there's some aspects of this evolution that we haven't even begun to imagine yet. But what can, billions, trillions of IUOCs do when they all cooperate?
Awakening needs to happen, and that basically is the essence of spiritual awakening, which is sometimes misinterpreted. People think spiritual awakening is when you suddenly see, I suddenly saw the angel came towards me, or you say, God spoke to me. Mostly it's your mind, but so You're going to say something?
No. I was just holding on to every word, and I was waiting for it to come out, and then you stopped.
So the wonderful thing is it's not that difficult really to step out of the stream of thinking. One way, of course, is meditation. The traditional approach is you have certain periods of time, once or twice a day, when you sit down.
It's interesting because for myself, and Eckhart and I were talking earlier about, and he was just talking about this event where he woke up. But if you think about what happens to a number of people who have engaged either in chronic negative thought, often manifested by negative behavior, they get so down, and this is like an addict, right? They finally get to very bottom, and it's either they're going to die or there has to be this transformation. And this is when you see these sudden, I think, breaks that can give you insight or, unfortunately, sometimes can lead to death. But I think we talk about these techniques to learn these things, to how to separate, if you will, that ego or that negative talk, and one is certainly mindfulness. But really, one of the things that's really interesting is how is it that the brain is able to do this in this one instant? And this is one of the things that I think, looking at the neuroscience of this, we're trying to learn. Because you have spent, I know, and continue to spend many hours in introspection, and we have monks who spent 10,000, 20,000, 30,000 hours, but I don't think many of us have the ability to spend 10 or 20 or 30,000 hours trying to get there. Can you?
Okay. I don't think it's necessary to spend. Meditation is a wonderful tool for many people, and even meditation is not necessary for everybody. Some people awaken spiritually without ever coming into contact with any meditation technique or any spiritual teaching. They awaken simply because they can't stand the suffering anymore. And then something inside them snaps suddenly, and there is a disidentification from thinking. This, for example, has happened to people that acted out, whereas before they were identified with continuously with the thinking, me, the self, me. Oh, so dreadful. And then they think it's only 6 more months to live is the worst fate that could happen to a human, and it could if you're in your thoughts. And then suddenly something snaps and they go out into, oh, there's only this moment. And so there's an intense awareness of the present moment. By chance, I read last week in the BBC news, there's an English pop musician, I can't remember his name unfortunately, who has just been told that he has pancreatic cancer and has 6 months to live. And he said, and this is a very rare case, usually people go into deep suffering first before they come out of it, if they do. This man was told that he had pancreatic cancer and only a few more months to live, and he walked out of the doctor's office, and he said he was in a state of total exhilaration and elation, because suddenly he was absolutely present, and he looked at every blade of grass, and every little thing was intensely alive. He said, I've never lived like that. And why was I so worried about my problems all my life? Why did I miss all that? So he said it was the most wonderful thing that ever happened to him. And this is rare to immediately go there. But so there's a potential when you suffer. I've also had many letters, communications from people in prison. Put in prison, maybe that's good news. No, I don't think you either you have to do 30,000 hours of meditation or live in an ashram for 20 years. Once you get a glimpse of it, you can invite it into your life, in daily life. I call it mini meditations. and actually step out of thinking and into presence. If I may just go to a little example now, just for you to experience as you sit here. You can play around as you sit here with your attention. You can direct your attention, for example, onto your visual perceptions, where this is the room, this is the speaker here, the lights, the ceiling. You can direct your attention into your hands. You can feel the aliveness in your hands. You can choose where your attention goes. It doesn't have to be in thinking. You can direct your attention into the feeling of your body on the chair. So there's a choice of where you want to put your attention. And then you can direct your attention. If I ask you, what does it feel like to be you? This is a very strange question. Now you may not know exactly where to direct your attention. And I'm not talking of the body, you, of a deeper sense of beingness. What does it feel like to be you without remembering your history, not me, the person who had that kind of experience and that kind of, no, a deeper sense of the more essential sense of I-ness, of beingness. What does that feel like? So I'm asking you to direct your attention to something very intangible, but you may get a glimpse of what that intangible thing or no thing is. And the strange thing is, it is no different from the attention itself. So when you look for yourself with the spotlight of your attention, and then you realize the attention itself is it. That, in other words, you recognize yourself as
The challenge.
yes, that's an enormous restriction that most humans seem to live as if past and future were much more important than the present moment. And usually it's the case when you are up to a certain age, future is much more important. Then when there's not that much future left anymore, the past becomes much more important. You can all see that when you're older, your grandfathers or parents, whatever, they start to talk more and more about, the older they get, the more they talk about the past. Whereas most of you are young, probably tend to think more in terms of the next moment, the next and the next. It's not realizing that we actually, to a large extent, ignore, do not truly value, don't fully acknowledge, are not fully aligned with internally this moment, which is, and it's not, is it a revolutionary statement to say there's only ever the present moment? That's all you ever have, not the future and not the past. You can never experience anything in the future. In that sense, the future will never come, because when it comes, it's the present. There's only ever this moment. And if habitually you live in you have an antagonistic relationship with the present moment, as many people have, and that's due to this continuous stream of thinking, takes you out of the present moment, believing I need to get there because the fulfillment of my life is there, but never here. If that becomes a pattern, even if you achieve what you want, if the pattern is deeply lodged in your mind that I'm going to be fulfilled in the next moment or the one after that, that will probably remain even when you achieve certain things. For a moment you'll be happy and fulfilled, and then the old pattern will re-emerge and you'll find unhappiness again. That happened to me shortly before the shift in consciousness happened. In a lotus position, which I wouldn't be able to do, and they go, and the example that's sometimes given, there's the man doing his meditation on metta. Metta meditation is a meditation on loving kindness, which is you spreading your, may everybody here in this house be well and happy, may I be well and happy, may everybody in this city be well and happy. So you spread out the desire for everybody to be well and happy. This is the loving kindness meditation. It's quite a lovely meditation. And there's the man doing his metta loving kindness meditation, and the door opens, and his 7-year-old daughter comes in and says, "Daddy, Daddy, can't you leave me alone? Can't you see I'm doing my loving kindness meditation?" A typical example of not having integrated your spiritual practice into everyday life. And this is why I recommend mini meditations during the day, just a few seconds at a time, when you actually become present. So, for example, I recommend certain activities that you do habitually. Why not, instead of using those activities as a means to an end, give them your fullest attention so that they become an end in themselves. For example, washing your hands. You can actually be amazed when you give it your full attention how pleasant it is to wash your hands. There is the feel of the water, very pleasant. There's perhaps the scent of the soap. There's the feeling of touch. And you may also wet your face. I do that always when I wash my hands. The cool water on your face after you've washed your hands. And then you dry your hands. It is a very pleasant and enjoyable experience. Or walking up the stairs, if there's a stairs somewhere in where you work or study or at home, every time you walk up the stairs, why not, instead of making it a means to an end because you want to get to the top of the stairs, so just be aware of every step and just enjoy the movement of it. It's very, very pleasant. Waiting, I recommend that whenever you're waiting for something, instead of waiting, use that opportunity to use it as a mini meditation. So instead of waiting, basically means you want the next moment, but not this one. This is why you're waiting. Otherwise, you wouldn't be waiting, you would just be there. So when you're waiting for the elevator, when you're waiting, there's something pushing you inside you that wants to get ahead to the next moment, but it can't get there because the elevator isn't here. And so when you push for the elevator, and instead of waiting, why not just be there, totally present, without straining away from the now internally, want to get to the elevator which isn't here. Just use that moment and become fully. Maybe take a few breaths. Give attention to your breath. It's a wonderful way of taking attention away from thinking when you don't want it and don't need it. The Buddha already recommended breath meditation, which simply means to observe or to feel yourself breathing. And you will notice you cannot think and feel yourself breathing. It's either one or the other. So when you're standing in front of the elevator, take your attention away from the mind, which means it moves into the present moment. Take a few conscious breaths and enjoy this moment of not waiting. Or the supermarket checkout counter, which is a source of frustration for many people.
Well, that's where I read the Inquirer.
Yes, that could be an escape into some kind of, it's mostly lies in there, so that's... So these are mini meditations. I think they are very helpful. Probably I would prefer, I believe these are more effective to incorporate many such mini meditations into your everyday life than to have totally separate compartments in your life. One is your spiritual practice and the rest, and then there's the rest of your life. I'm not saying the mini meditation means you cannot also have a spiritual practice, but if you want to choose either one or the other, I would prefer the mini meditations because they become part of your everyday life. So you're less likely to have two compartments in your life.
Speaking of, you were talking about compassion, meta practice. One of the challenges for many people, and one of the confounds in the neuroscience research, is this issue of in-group versus out-group. And we understand from an evolutionary level why this has occurred, but I think to survive as a species, we have to figure out ways to expand this in-group, and maybe you can comment on what your thoughts are on how we do that.
What do you mean by in-group?
The people who you have your group that you automatically feel close to or love,
yes,
versus people you've never met, or in fact
yes.
maybe have no opinion about, or in fact maybe even dislike.
Yes.
How do you spread compassion, care,
Yes.
love, to embrace them.
Right. Yes.
And then also, especially people you may not like or have differences of opinion with, how do you embrace that? Because your response oftentimes is an emotional response.
Yes. Yes. That's a very important point. The the one sense of self, in our Western world, most people have a predominantly a personal sense of self, derived from their life experiences and all forms of conditioning. Prior to a personal sense of self, humans apparently had a tribal sense of self. So once their sense of identity was not so much based on me, it was mainly based on us. So that began with the tribe. It's our tribe. And when the dreadful thing one could do to a person, and still perhaps is the case in some older societies, for somebody to be expelled from the tribe would be like a death sentence. Not just physically, but even psychologically, the person would virtually die. So tribal consciousness is still very much alive in humans, and this is in some societies and in the 20th century, in certain time periods in the 20th century, was very strongly, very pronounced as nationalism, which led to the huge world wars and the madness of the 20th century. So that was really a regression to the tribal consciousness, which if you think that the egoic consciousness that's totally identified with the sense of the me, the conceptual me in the head, if you think that's mad, the thing that's more mad is the collective conscious, the collective me. So it is still the case that many people can have compassion and empathy with those who belong to their group, tribal group. And some people can only have compassion and empathy with the members of their family or extended family. They just cannot go beyond that. Anybody who is beyond the family is the stranger. So you cannot recognize another as a true human being. And you still have within countries, you have certain regions that are totally have this tribal consciousness. And then that you have the tribal consciousness that surfaces in religions very strongly still. Potentially religion is a wonderful thing, and the origin of religion, of course, is usually there was somebody who had a deep insight into the oneness of all life and attempted to teach that to others, the compassion, the love, to recognizing the other as yourself. And yet, unfortunately, mostly the beautiful original teaching got hijacked by the egoic mind and used for its own purposes. And now we have, as a result, to a large extent, although not completely, there are pockets in religion that are deeply spiritual, but in many religions are a divisive force in our world rather than something that unites us. And even within the same religion, people kill each other because it's another church or another. These people don't quite share our beliefs. They believe that this thing happened, and we believe that thing happened 600 years ago, and they don't believe that, so they must be evil. This happens when you conceptualize other human beings in your head. First, you conceptualize your tribal identity, us, and you have certain characteristics. Then you have to strengthen your tribal identity by having others who do not share that. The egoic self loves its enemies. and by the way, the personal sense of self loves its problems. So the egoic self defines itself more clearly by having the non-believers, for example, in the case of religions, the infidels, they are satanic beings out there. Or some people think the whole of America is satanic. There are probably millions of people who have the weird idea in their head, America is satanic. They've never, and if they ever met an American, they would completely, all they would see when they hear American, the screen of conceptualization, satanic, and they wouldn't see you at all. They cannot differentiate between a saintly figure who is American and a brutal murderer who is American, he's just American. They can't, there should just be a street. It's incredible what the mind can do to you, how it can totally obscure your perception of reality.
Not appreciate it. He likes movies. One of the movies, which I know you've talked about, is Groundhog Day. There's actually some great enlightenment from that movie, and maybe you can...
Yeah. Well, if you haven't seen, you must see it, Groundhog Day. Yeah, I've seen it maybe 6 or 7 times, and I'm sure I'll see it a few more times. Just to refresh your memory, if you have seen it, and then explain why I love it so much, what the very important message is. There's this man, the protagonist, the actor is Bill Murray. So his character is a weather forecaster. And so he is told very, very negative. He dislikes most people. He dislikes his job. Wherever he goes, he complains and is unhappy. And that is his sense of identity. That is how he lives. So he travels to this place in Pennsylvania or somewhere. And
is it Puscatawny?
Yes. And they have this ceremony. They release the groundhog on Groundhog Day to see if he goes back into his cage, because he is supposed to forecast how long the winter is going to last. So he's the weatherman, so he goes there with his team, a man and a woman, the cameraman and his assistant, just to film that. But he's just so unhappy and negative, dislikes this an awful place here. I want to get out of here as soon as I can. What a dreadful place to be, what a dump. And these are his thoughts, not the reality. They're his thoughts, but to him, that's his reality. And then, of course, he wakes up after they've done the filming. The next morning, they're supposed to go home. He wakes up, the bell rings, okay. And they can't get out of town because there's a snowstorm. They have to stay another night in this dump, this awful place. The next morning, he wakes up, and then a strange thing happens. The same thing happened to him the previous day. And then he begins to realize that he's reliving of suffering. And so that is the deeper message, that the way and so basically, I would say everybody who is still totally identified with their conditioned mind lives his or her own Groundhog Day, because not exactly, but the conditioned mind tends to replicate itself. And if you're totally identified with the conditioning of your mind, which includes reactive patterns and so on, you tend to recreate similar life experiences through your reactions, and you tend to even to recreate similar relationships. Some of you might have noticed that tend to attract certain kinds of people. Why this seems very strange, but it happens. And that's because so basically, everybody has his or her Groundhog Day in the head until they transcend it.
And it's wonderful you said that, ended that, because this is a metaphor for the power of compassion, if you will, because look what happened in his life. He was self-absorbed, everything was miserable, it wasn't good enough for him. And this is an inward placement of his worldview. It was only until he looked outward and embraced others and recognized their suffering and the power of intersecting with them and trying to relieve their suffering, that he was finally released from his own suffering.
Yes.
And on that note, I think we'll end our dialogue, but we do have time for some questions, unless, of course, we've enlightened everyone and there are no more questions.
Well, that's possible too, yeah.
Are there microphones on either side?
I'm young, I'm restless, and I'm optimistic that I can change the future for the better.
Good.
But I also hear that you say that we should focus on the present
Yes.
And well, you talk about Groundhog Day and focusing on the present. So then, how do you bring about innovation and change when
Yes.
not focusing on the present?
Yes. You may remember I briefly mentioned it is important to have a destination, to have an intention, to know what it is you want to achieve in this world. Plan and to contribute to the world, but to realize the quality is highly important. It's not only what you do, the quality of doing, the consciousness that flows into what you do is even more important. In other words, how you do what you do is more important than what you do. You could have a store serving customers with this or that, which perhaps would not be regarded as a very important job, and yet if that is done with a quality of presence where every customer who comes into your store, you give this person, just an example, your fullest attention, you appreciate him or her as a human being, you see how you can best serve him or her in the present moment, that is quality. And then you would be improving. Everybody who comes into contact with you would somehow experience a small lifting in their being, in consciousness. And so that you could create even a person with a relatively simple job could contribute in that way to creating a better world. And if you have a huge project, this is wonderful, of course, but I would suggest or recommend that you are careful that you give your fullest attention to whatever step you're taking in the present moment towards your goal, because the step is as important as the goal. In fact, the quality of the step determines the goal. So the means never justifies the ends. The means and ends go together. You cannot have bad means to achieve a good end. It may look like that, but give your fullest attention to the doing. See if you can be fully aligned with it so that you don't generate negative energy because you want to create a better world. So that you create positive energy as you are about to create a better world. So it's a balance, being fullest attention to the now and yet knowing very well what it is that you want to achieve. Then also the element of creativity, you can access that much more fully when internally you open yourself to the present moment and you honor the aliveness of the present moment. You get far more insights into what you need to do, what is needed, and this may sound a little bit, I hope not too new agey, but when you are fully aligned with the present, for certain things, of course, thoughts are needed to deal with certain practical matters. So there's no problem there. What do you apply your thoughts? What do I need here? Then there are thoughts that arise in daily life. They just come into your head, and you can notice how this particular thought makes you feel. So you can detect the feeling quality behind the thought. And if the feeling quality is not good, it's a bit like eating something that doesn't make you feel good. Once it reaches the stomach, it feels, oh. So there are many thoughts of that kind that give you that feeling that is not pleasant. For example, thoughts that generate anxiety, thoughts about what's going to happen, or imagining problems that might arise tomorrow, and believing virtually that this is a reality already. And this is called worry, is a particular mind pattern that many people are familiar with. Worry means to think of things that could go wrong and how they could go wrong and how they probably will go wrong because they always tend to go wrong. So that's a very familiar thing. And then you detect, how does that make you feel? Worry doesn't feel good. If you feel in the body, there's fear associated with worry. So there's anxiety that arises. You feel a constriction in the body. So the feeling will often tell you what kind of thought it is, whether it's true or not. And then you can recognize certain thoughts as not productive and as thoughts that you would choose not to have if you had a choice. But the wonderful thing is that you do have a choice. And it is actually possible to drop certain thoughts when you recognize them as having no function whatsoever except to make you unhappy. And there's a wide range of thoughts that has no function whatsoever except to make you unhappy. But sometimes the egoic self actually even loves its unhappiness because it's so familiar. So every therapist is familiar with clients who do not want to let go of their neurosis because they feel at home with it. So, but if you recognize these thoughts as not helpful, then it's easier to, okay, don't follow them where they want to take you. And by choice, you remember what we said about attention? You actually realize you can choose where you want your attention to go. The thoughts pretend to be all powerful and try to get all your attention, saying, no, my choice is not to continue this train of thought, but to take my attention into my breathing. Oh, much nicer. A minute ago, I was terribly worried, and now I actually feel alive. And it's quite pleasant to be here in this moment. It's not a hell. I thought I was in hell. And I was only in bed.
Good evening, and thank you for tonight. One of my favorite jokes was that parents give advice to their children because they cannot be an example. So how do we help our children be present and separate themselves from their thoughts that we are teaching them to think?
Yes.
And
Well,
so on.
You've already answered your question, because predominantly it's not by telling them, but by living it yourself, because that transmits itself. How the way in which their parents live is the greatest teaching for the children. As you rightly said, what they tell them is very much secondary, and sometimes it contradicts the way they live. The parents tell the child, don't swear like that, and the child says, but you do it all the time. So if the parents live consciously and bring more presence into life, that is the teaching. Occasionally they may say a word or two to point in that direction, but basically the answer is you've already given the answer. Yeah. Thank
Yes,
you.
sir.
Thank you for being here. So Osho, when he talks about how he reached enlightenment, talks about the fact that effort was necessary but not sufficient. At some point, it was an obstacle.
Yes.
But when he dropped the effort, it happened.
Yes.
So what triggered your awareness at the age of 29, apart from unhappiness, in terms of the book you read? How was your day look like?
Oh, it was purely triggered by suffering. So I didn't make a spiritual effort to reach any kind of state. It was purely what Osho said. Of course, in some cases, it also applies. People who have a spiritual practice and put a lot of effort into their spiritual practice, while they put the effort into the spiritual practice, and this is very much exemplified in the life of the Buddha, who had a spiritual practice for quite a number of years, and he had several teachers, and he became extremely good at every spiritual practice, and he became an ascetic monk, and he only ate and drank an absolute minimum. He almost starved himself to death, and so he had a very strenuous spiritual practice, and suddenly he saw this does not lead to awakening. And then he dropped, as you said, happened to Osho too, he dropped all effort. And at that point, the story goes that all of his disciples left him because he has abandoned the true path. Of course, he had not. He dropped all effort and then was able to simply enter the present moment fully. Now, the question might arise, couldn't he have done that without the effort and just go into the present moment directly? I don't know. In his case, he needed the effort, and in my case, I needed the suffering. So what was in his case the effort, in my case was the suffering, which is also an effort. To make yourself suffer is a great effort.
Yes, sir.
Thank you for being here. So I've really enjoyed today. I feel like you've talked about sort of a pragmatic wearing of this school of thought philosophy, which really resonates with me, and I'm sure a lot of folks in here. Sometimes where I struggle is when I take it to, I hypothetically put myself in the extremes of the situation, that is the complete disassociation from my ego or from the collective ego. And this arises in some of the work I do with the clients I work with too, where it's, you are not your